My universe will never be the same. I'm glad you came.
Hello dears, and welcome to my show. I'm your friendly neighborhood librarian, reading the stinkers and praising the masterpieces since 2012. And if that lovely musical riff didn't clue you in, it's true. Today, we're taking on the big one. And by big one, I mean a certain mythological text that seems to get precedence here in the United States above all other mythological texts. A text reported by many to be historical fact. Some think our country was founded on the tenets in this book. It's on our money, it's in our pledge, we swear on this book in court, which is sort of hilarious considering that other people of other religions as well as atheists also testify in court, and of course during this delightful holiday season. One specific holiday is lorded above all the rest. So of course the book I am referring to is I kid. Some other time. Perhaps.
This is my True Images Bible. It's the New International Version, and it's the Bible for teen girls. Updated edition.
Oh, goody! As you might imagine, this was a gift from my mother. She had certain concerns over my immortal soul, you see, which is understandable. There really isn't much of a difference between adolescence and being a Satanist. So, let's dive right into the sacred word.
Once upon a time, there were primitive people curious about the world around them. They didn't have Google, or even stupid Bing, so they had to make up stories to make the mysteries of the universe seem less overwhelming and more comprehensible. Unfortunately, they didn't have access to scientific knowledge, so their stories could get a little wacky. As human ignorance began to decline with the advent of science, technology, and scholars, superstitions too began to wane. Most old beliefs died off, but some remained, including one book supposedly inspired by the creator of the universe himself. It's long.
This version is made longer because it's got some preaching to do interspersed with the scripture. I don't see why humans think they have anything of value to add to supplement God's words, but apparently they need augmentation. So, let's start with the part specific to the True Images version and see what these writers have to say. Ooh, this looks interesting. Am I gay? This is written from the point of view of a 14-year-old girl who is wondering whether she might be gay. I was really getting into this story until it cited the reason for the girl thinking that she might be gay, which was because she was sexually abused by a man and since then hasn't wanted any men to touch her. I have no words. It then directs us to Romans chapter 1, verse 24 through 32, and Leviticus chapter 18 to 22. The first which explains that homosexuality is a punishment God gave to the wicked and characterizes gay people as, and I quote, depraved, wicked, evil, envious, murderous, deceptive, malicious, gossipy, slanderous, God-hating, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventing new ways of doing evil, disobedient, senseless, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. Whew. Leviticus just said that gay people deserve to be put to death. But it's okay because of this nifty insert. God's punishment for sexual sins seem harsh by today's standards. However, these laws show God's deep concern for preserving our most intimate relationship. What? What? If you put people to death, you won't preserve any relationship with them. Was that interesting bit of rhetoric supposed to convince me of anything? Okay, this one seems promising. It's a story called Let Doubts Drive You Deeper. It follows Kayla as she questions God for the first time after her biology teacher says that humans need a God to feel secure, so we make one up. So she goes to her older, Christian brother for advice. Okay, let's stop it right there. So, when having doubts about her faith, she does not go to an impartial advisor, but to someone who she knows will just reaffirm the beliefs and who has an agenda of convincing her that what he believes is also something that she should believe. Well, the ending of that story is pretty much a foregone conclusion. It looks like these in-focus stories, written from the point of view of female teenage Christians, is supposed to personalize what is largely a kind of impersonal text. It's filled with misleading propaganda. In particular, I like how it characterizes atheists as snobbish, pompous, and grossly ignorant. That's fair and balanced.
Journalism, fair and balanced.
The thing about this propaganda, though, is that it has one failing. It only works on female teenage Christians. These are the kinds of stories that everyone else would find pretty ridiculous because they are so out of touch. I actually enjoyed reading them, but only because I find them hilarious. They weren't adept at convincing me of anything. It's fine to have stories that cater to a demographic, but all this does is reassert already held beliefs, and isn't the whole point to save the damned, not preach to the choir? Oh well. So, let's look at the text itself, disregarding the epically poorly framed stories. The main character of all this proceedings is, of course, God. And I have to admit that God is a very interesting character. It's strange that he seems to be presented as a perfect role model, though. Especially throughout the Old Testament. That's Genesis to Malachi. God is a very powerful brute. Well, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? He has a certain flair for the dramatic, too. Oftentimes, even though he can do anything with a thought, with a snap of his fingers, he prefers to make his little human puppets dance for him first. Fighting wars, creating spectacles. God has some interesting rules. He's not a fan of gay love, as aforementioned, because it is a sin. And if there's one thing that God cannot stand, it's sin. But what exactly is the nature of sin? Well, I'm not really sure from the book. It really just seems to be a bunch of arbitrary rules laid out based upon the whims of a tyrannical overlord.
66 rules are police, 666 rules you must heed.
Sin isn't necessarily something that harms anybody. Consensual gay sex, for example, is perfectly harmless to both people involved or anyone else. But God does condone slavery, which I'm pretty sure is harmful. So slaveholding is not a sin, but gay marriage is? See where my confusion comes from? However, God has his pet people, the Israelites, who he doesn't like to see enslaved. When the Egyptians enslaved the people of Israel, early on in Exodus, then God gets pretty angry. So rather than intervening directly, he sends Moses, one of his followers, to go talk sense into the Pharaoh. When it doesn't work, just as God knew it wouldn't, God makes all these splashy displays of magic, like turning his stick into a snake and turning a lake to blood. All the evidence you could ask for, really. That he doesn't continue to do stuff like that in modern day, right? That could probably save a lot of people, according to this mythology. But okay, so these grand displays still don't convince the Pharaoh. But do you know why? Because God specifically hardened the Pharaoh's heart, so the Pharaoh would not be able to see reason. Then, God started mercilessly plaguing all the civilians in Egypt with plagues and famines and boils, just because they happened to live under the rule of a corrupt monarch, all the while continuing to repeatedly harden the Pharaoh's heart. Finally, God slaughters all the firstborn children in the kingdom. So, this is the equivalent of disagreeing with President Obama and killing me because I live in the United States and am an eldest sister, and not just me, all eldest siblings in the US, just to teach Obama to stop being such a meanie. I think it's safe to say that God is the ultimate troll. Still, you've got to admit, with all that power, I suppose it would be boring to have everything go your way all the time. But even when things aren't going your way, they really are, because you're the one who enabled it to go that way. And God apparently knows everything. He has always had a perfect understanding of everything. Never torn his hair out in frustration over a particularly difficult calculus problem. Never scratched his head trying to decipher Old English. Never even had to say, "What was that? I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that." Everything. What a boring existence to never be able to learn anything, ever. To never be surprised, to never experience an epiphany, to never figure anything out. I can't even imagine how dull that would be. So he got bored one day around 6,000 years ago and decided to create the universe. And for the infinite time he was around before then, I kind of wonder what he was putzing around doing, but finally he decided to create the universe. I don't really blame him for looking at the world as his little plaything to interact with, like his own little Sims game. Sure, I've been a sadistic little librarian to my own Sims to express all my pent-up aggression, but I think things would change if I knew that my Sims were sentient beings instead of pixels in a computer program. Also, I'd treat my Sims better if I loved them. God claims to love his creations, which is why it's odd that he would drown them all in Genesis. Everyone except one family and a small select group of animals. Let's examine that for a moment. First of all, I find it highly unlikely that the whole world, except for one family, would be so irredeemably bad that they would all righteously deserve a painfully watery demise. I would like to know more about what the prerequisites were for being wicked and being righteous, but unfortunately, little details like that were left out. Second, if I loved someone, I could never drown them. Ever. No matter how much they screwed up, and believe me, people I love have indeed screwed up. Murder isn't a punishment that a loving person would inflict on someone. It doesn't give them room to grow or change their ways.
It just makes people dead.
Third, at any given point, someone or other is usually pregnant within the population of the whole world, so at least one, and probably several pregnant women were caught in this flood. Were the unborn fetuses wicked, too? How about all the infants, toddlers, and children? And even if they were, if they had a proper lifespan, couldn't they have all learned and grown and changed? Isn't that an essential part of being human? And fourth, why did the animals have to die? I mean... we all know that killing animals for sport is despicable. It's not like God killed them for food or clothing or anything. He just killed them 'cause he could. PETA would have a heyday. And let us not forget that spectacle in the New Testament. With the Son of God, Jesus Christ, around whom some culture or other has sprung, Jesus was a tad less violent and volatile than his daddy, so a little less fun to read about, but not by much. The most interesting thing that happened was his execution, which apparently redeemed all humanity of its sins. And again, by sins, we mean arbitrary overlord decrees. Apparently, this human sacrifice was exactly what the doctor ordered because God couldn't forgive sin with... Wait, so there's something that God couldn't do. And the thing that God couldn't do was forgive people he loves for making mistakes. And the only way for him to gain the ability of forgiveness was to have his son die in the most painful of all possible ways. Why was all this hoi polloi necessary? Like I said, he has a taste for the dramatic. Anyway, Jesus died for 3 days and then came back. Like a zombie. He's not the only zombie in this book either. See Lazarus. Now, why the Lord Christ Jesus had a 3-day waiting period before his resurrection was never fully explained. In fact, it seems whenever I press for the same details I would in any story in order to check if the plot is airtight and free of holes, the logic tends to fall through a little. There are several accounts of the resurrection with slightly different details, but they all agree that Jesus ascended into heaven after seeing only a few people to prove his divinity. God is elusive. He's mysterious, and his divine plans are often convoluted and argue better for his non-existence than his existence. And his book is kind of flawed. It has a lot of bad science in it, and oddly seems to be limited to the beliefs and knowledge of the time. God thought the world was flat, when people thought the world was flat. God thought slavery was okay when people thought slavery was okay. God thought animal and human sacrifice was not totally barbaric and unnecessary cruelty when that was a custom of the people. As for adaptations, well, there are tons of ways the Bible has been presented. Like DreamWorks came out with The Prince of Egypt, which is Moses' story, as well as Joseph, King of Dreams. They're both pretty good movies. I prefer Prince of Egypt myself. The story, like I said, lends itself very well to a dramatic form. The writers and animators did a great job of conveying the struggles and character growth in this mythological story. VeggieTales tells Bible stories through the venue of talking vegetables, and is probably the greatest thing you'll ever see in your life. Andrew Lloyd Webber, that crazed musician, did create Jesus Christ Superstar and Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, both musical adaptations of two prominent biblical figures, and they are both excellent. I don't think you can fault the Bible for not having a wealth of very interesting stories, although I still give the Greeks the distinction of having the most interesting mythology. Mel Gibson came out with The Passion of the Christ. It's kind of horrific. Shows details of the horrible practice of crucifixion execution in graphic, almost exploitative detail, so I wouldn't personally recommend that one. There's tons of biblical media out there, and if you're interested in them, search around and you'll probably find one that's right up your alley. Would I recommend the Bible? Well, if you're the type of person who would already read it, my answer to that question won't sway you one way or the other, but no, I wouldn't, and here's why. Reading it as literature, it fails. It tries to characterize God as perfect and just, but then refuses to back it up. There's a lot of unsupported claims and things that don't make sense and are never explained. In other words, it's full of plot holes. And God and Jesus Christ are the worst kind of Mary Sue. I actually like belligerent, hateful, flawed characters a lot. Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights is among one of my favorite literary characters of all time. But not if the text portrays them as perfect. I prefer my heroes to have flaws, acknowledge them, and grow from them, or else just be unabashedly bad. As long as the narrative and other characters know that the character is bad. And that's just it. This book reads like God's vanity project. You know the movies that superstars produce, write, and star in where everyone wants to get into their character's pants? Like that. In this book, it is lauded as a virtue if you're unquestioningly obedient and if you worship God and put Him first in your life always, even if He's destroying everything you hold near and dear. See the book of Job. You know, like a psychotic tyrant. And again, it's not that I don't like psychotic tyrant characters. It all has to do with the way the narrative treats them. The stories can be interesting, but they can also be dull. And the lineage parts, you know, he begat him, and then he begat him, and he begat her, and she begat him, and that's pretty yawn-inducing. And as for morals, well, I personally wouldn't recommend getting your morals from a book that says slavery is okay. It just seems kind of outdated, you know? So I'm going to give the Bible a score of 1 star out of 5. Especially this True Images one, because it's kind of offensive to everyone outside this demographic, and I'm not okay with promoting bigotry and impressionable teen minds. Adaptations? My favorites would probably have to be the VeggieTales series and The Prince of Egypt. I'd recommend them both because they focus their products on one specific story in which they can have a pretty plot-holeless, linear narrative. VeggieTales is for younger audiences, but I mean, I still enjoy it. Still, if you're into something a little more highbrow, The Prince of Egypt is the one for you. I give them both 3 stars out of 5 because while I don't advocate the brainwashing goal, I think if you're responsible enough to watch these as mythological stories, you might find them pretty interesting. Worst one? Passion of the Christ. No reason to watch that unless you get off on suffering, which is kind of a Catholic thing, I guess, but even so. I just don't think there's much substance to this that you couldn't get from some other Easter special without the exploitative, gory horror. So skip it. 1 star. And that is all I have to say about that.